religion, and if so, like, is it still carried on today? Like about Ragnarok?
Well, the religion of the Vikings we mostly know from things like sagas, especially the Icelandic sagas, and in popular culture now, like there are things like the Avengers Assemble and Thor and all that. Even though they are Hollywood films, there are elements in all the figures like Loki and Thor. They are actually historical mythological figures in Norse mythology. What we know of Norse mythology is often based in like Roman mythology. So you would say that Zeus, the Greek god, would be like the gods would in European countries would have the same gods, just have different names. So we know a fair bit about the Greek gods, like Thor, the god of thunder. Even in modern parlance, like the names of the week, Wednesday is named after Wotan. Wednesday, Woden's day. Thursday is Thor's day, and god of thunder. Friday is Freya's day, and Freya would be the goddess of fertility and goddess of love, similar to like Artemis or Diana. So we do know a fair bit about Greek mythology, especially from what the Icelandic sagas had recorded.
How many times per year does a Viking settle? Like, do they like travel around a lot, or like do they just settle in that one spot?
Well, we know that even up to the modern period, you would always have like the war season would generally be spring and summer, because the ground would be dry and it was much easier to travel around. And then we know from the Vikings that would leave Scandinavia to go raiding would generally be when the weather is good. You wouldn't want to be sailing out into the sea when there was treacherous weather that you didn't know about, high winds and gales, which you generally get around the winter time. And we know from settlements in Limerick, and especially the Longfort up in Ferryhill, that they were overwintering sites. So before they built major towns and cities, they came like to Limerick and to other parts in Ireland, and they built temporary forts so that they would be able to overwinter. So instead of raiding and then going all the way home and coming back again, one of the first times that the native Irish felt that instead of these piratical raids coming in every year, once they realized that the Vikings were actually overwintering and staying from one season onto the next, then they realized that they had bitten up more than they could chew, that they were definitely in trouble with these Viking raiders coming.
What was the heaviest weapon a Viking could wield?
Probably his shield, even though a shield would be a defensive weapon. It would be generally made of wood and rimmed with iron and covered with lead, sometimes with a central boss. It would be a defensive weapon, a defensive tool, but obviously in close contact you can use your shield to deflect and to move around. You would have like the fantasy Viking would often have like a double-headed axe, but that's generally down the fantasy realm, and a double axe is probably, you're more likely to injure yourself or one of your compatriots than you would to the other person. Like, people would be surprised how light like a Viking sword would be. Like a Viking sword would only be about 75 centimeters long, made from iron and sometimes even of steel. They're remarkably light. I mean, they'd only weigh like 50 ounces. You would have like, for a heavy weapon, you'd have your bearded axe, which is a small axe which you kind of keep down here as a secondary weapon. One of your primary weapons would be a Dane axe, which would be up about this high with the shaft, and then the large front blade of it. Yeah. But even then, even though the Dane axe is quite large a weapon, it's actually very thin, and you want a weapon to be quite light. I mean, you need, the momentum is what you need when you're fighting someone. It's not the weight, of the weapon itself. I mean, the momentum and the power of your own swing. Yeah. From your own physical attributes, that's where the power would come from in a weapon, not necessarily the weight of the weapon itself. And plus, a lighter weapon would often be much more nimble and quicker. So as if you had a heavy weapon like Thor's hammer, if you were like, oh, then you're stuck down here. and someone could attack you while it's being wasted, and then the centrifugal force would move around. So generally, weapons in general are much lighter than you would think they would be.
The Viking treated the local people, and how was the local people's reaction towards them?
Very good question. The Vikings started to come to Ireland, and they were mainly raiders and raiding monasteries and total towns. So obviously, the native Irish people didn't like these interlopers coming in and burning and sacking everything. After a while, once the Vikings settled in Ireland, they were the first people to build towns and cities in Ireland, so that the Vikings kind of had to go and defend themselves, because they were the people in foreign territory. And there were many wars and battles in Ireland, in Limerick even, where that the Vikings came in, and then the native Irish from over in Thomond came in and took over the city, and then there were battles where the Vikings took it back over again. After a few decades, I think the Vikings and the native Irish kind of realised that they had to work together, and that the native Irish knew that the Vikings were able to get gold, silver, silks, all these things which the natives have never seen before, and they were able to earn money and create their own wealth from trading with the Vikings. It is known there was a battle when the Irish took over the city from the Vikings. The final time was in a place called Singland, which is where Sir Patrick's Well is in Garryowen, and we know that when the Irish eventually finally defeated the Vikings, that they sold all the women to slavery, and they killed all the men, and they stole all the gold and all the jewels from the city, and then burnt the city. But then a year or two later, some of the Vikings came back, and then Limerick became what we know as a Hiberno-Norse town. So it was Irish and Viking, and they worked together. Going forward about 400 years after the Anglo-Normans came in the 13th, 14th century, there were still Viking families in Limerick, and because they were in Ireland for so long, that in Limerick the English were able to be in the corporation and to be in juries, but the Irish weren't allowed to be in the city and to be merchants. But the Viking families were, and we know from lists of juries and court cases that even centuries later, that the Vikings were still held in high regard within the city.
And at the time the Viking come, how was the local government system? Like, did Ireland had only one king, or
Ireland would have had sometimes a high king, but then hundreds of small kings. And what we always have to remember that we now think of only the Vikings raiding the monasteries and destroying churches, but the Irish were always doing that themselves. So we picked on the Vikings because they were the outsider. But we say it's internecine warfare. There's warfare constantly happening. The Vikings are fighting with the Irish, the Irish are fighting against the Irish, and the Vikings are fighting the Vikings. So it's very, very complex and always fluid and always changing.
Can you tell me, is there still anywhere in the world where Viking culture is still being kept alive?
Realistically, no. It's too far gone in time for us to realistically know or to get into their minds. Obviously, you'd say Scandinavia itself is if you'd ever been to Scandinavia or have ever met people from Norway, Sweden, they're very particular. Iceland, obviously, because as an island nation, and Iceland only has a population of about 300,000 people, so it's about the size of Cork. So in Iceland, almost everyone kind of knows each other. So I'd say Iceland is the nearest we can get, and especially then that the Viking sagas and legends, they were the ones. The oral tradition of the Vikings was first written down in Iceland, so we know the most historically from that. But to actually get into the mind of a Viking and to understand what they were about, their superstitions, their beliefs, their needs, their wants, I don't think we can appreciate in the 21st century with all our mod cons and electricity what it was actually really like to be a Viking.
Question is, what would Limerick be like without the Vikings?
What would Limerick be without? Well, Limerick wouldn't exist without the Vikings finding it and founding it in the first place, probably. Although strategically, later invaders probably would have found that the site of Limerick on King's Island behind us would have been a good spot. But we can't, even though like there are cities like Cork, especially Dublin and Waterford, that have much more excavations and local knowledge about Vikings. I mean, a lot of people in Limerick wouldn't know that the Vikings actually founded the city. So, and it is something that we probably as a city should look more into our heritage for that. But again, as I was saying earlier in the previous question, that the Vikings, even though they were defeated by the Irish and they lost control of the city, they still remained within the city, and there's still kind of Viking family names still around the city and the county in Ireland. So it's hard to figure out, because Viking architecture was mostly made of wood, and then later buildings like the cathedral and the harbour have been built on top of it. So it's hard to see the Viking heritage because it's deep underground. But like, I do have a red beard under here, so there is a lecturer in Mary Mackinac College who did some DNA studies she picked people that lived in Ireland for a long time with surnames such as Seward, Siller and Harold, and she tested them for DNA from all the people in Limerick and all around Ireland, and she found that there was actually quite a lot of genetic inheritance still left in the people that live in Limerick today.
And do you think the red beard is a symbol of the
no, well, I have fair skin, blue eyes. I get sunburned quite easy, but that is probably something that maybe has something to do with Viking heritage, but it probably has as much to do with Neanderthal heritage as well at the same time.
And do you think there are many Viking heritage in Ireland?
I think there's a lot more than we think of, and there's probably more than we appreciate, but again, we have to take it all together. Instead of being Vikings or Anglo-Normans or Native Irish, I mean, they didn't live in isolation, they all had to kind of live together. So it's the remnant that the society that we have today obviously has links going back the centuries. The idea and image of Viking wearing horns is something that is one of the first things you think of when you think of the word Viking, is the horned helmet. But we know from archaeology that wearing horns like that wouldn't be in battle, it wouldn't be a good idea, because it was just too much of a target to hit. There are only about 3 or 4 actual intact Viking helmets that have ever been found in museums in Europe, and they don't have any horns. They're conical in shape, and then they have covering over the eyes and the nose and the nasal. The idea for the Vikings wearing horns probably actually goes back to only the 19th century in operas that were written by Richard Wagner, the famous composer in the 19th century. And many of his operas were about German and Norse mythology. And in some of the operas, especially the Ring Cycle, to differentiate some of the actors who were wearing the Vikings in the scene, they used different helmets for each actor. Some would have wings on the helmet, and some would have horns in the helmet, so you'd know who was who. And I think in the popular imagination, that is where the idea of the Vikings having horned helmets probably came from. We know from the names of some of the Vikings that came to Ireland that they were spread out geographically in Norway, and then when they came to Ireland, they spread out as well. So, like, generally in Ireland, the Viking capital would have been Dublin. That was the largest city, but that Dublin was always fighting for supremacy over Limerick and Waterford. And there are other Viking towns like Wexford and Cork, but Limerick, Waterford and Dublin were definitely the cities and towns that come up again and again. And they often created alliances against each other and for each other. So we definitely know the Vikings were always fighting for supremacy over they, they, all the wealth that was coming from Ireland. So, like Dublin was the main slave capital in all of Europe for a lot of the 10th and 11th century, and there was a lot of money to be made. So the Vikings would often fight against. Now we're used to wars and world wars and things that last a couple of years, but back then, every year, year after year, it was constant, and that's why Vikings, when they first settled in Ireland, they had to build forts and they had to build towns with walls to defend themselves, because it was almost tiring that the warfare would never end. You would have agreements between certain Viking towns and agreements between the Vikings and the local Irish, but they would always be betrayed, and they would always fight each other and stab people in the back. It was a constant thing. So it was constant war in Ireland at the time.